Senate Bill 362, is really pretty straightforward. It's nothing more than when I walk in to vote and I lay out my voter registration, that person across from me can recognize that I am who I represent to be, that I am that person on the roll, and I feel I have an obligation to represent that I am a legal, living person that has the right to vote, and I am that person on that roll. Under Texas law today, we do not have that ability.
Respectfully, we will vote no on this resolution. It's because, Senator Duncan, it's not about voter ID. I've always looked forward to the day when discrimination and voter suppression are things of the past, but the fact that we have to debate voter ID tells me that we aren't there yet. This voter ID bill echoes a history of voter suppression in our great state, but unfortunately, it's not just a minority voting rights that are threatened by the voter ID bill. The laws threaten seniors and lower income Texans who don't drive and don't have a photo ID and have no easy or free way to get one. Your proposals for debate are taken into consideration, but I hope you will understand why we will vote no on the resolution, not to disrespect you, but of our real need to unite to solve Texas' real problems. It's the special treatment of this voter ID bill that proves some politicians still don't get the message that the voters sent to us in this last election cycle. With all due respect, Senator Duncan, that's why we cannot support your resolution. That's why we cannot support this resulting process, and ultimately why we cannot support the resulting legislation.
Identity matters. I can't go to my bank and cash a check or another bank without my photo ID. Identity matters. I mean, you could go on and on, the library books. Identity matters. And in this case, I think that's, in fact, what we're doing.
So there are numerous since-debunked reports of voter fraud, and these reveal that there are very few, little to no examples of any confirmed impersonation fraud. That's not for a lack of trying. You've heard about the 5-year investigation by the Department of Justice, which failed to charge any individual with impersonation fraud. Here in Texas, Attorney General Abbott spent 2 years and $1.4 million fighting voter fraud. Didn't indict a single person for impersonation fraud.
And let me tell you the other thing that photo ID does, and this is the most significant thing that photo ID did in Indiana. You guys have spent the last 14 or so hours. We've got Republicans pointing at Democrats and saying voter fraud. We've got Democrats pointing at Republicans and saying voter suppression. Well, what photo ID has done in Indiana, it's taken that argument off the table. We've been unable to engage in election reform, and we in Indiana weren't able to do that for years because we just pointed at each other that way. Photo ID brought confidence to the parties, to the Republicans, to the Democrats, to allow us to engage in meaningful election reform.
It seems to me when you come to fundamental rights, the burden is on the proponents of this bill to justify it. If we were talking about regulating advertising or some other interest that is not fundamental to what it is to be an American, I would take on the burden and acknowledge that it's, you know, my burden to perhaps justify in excruciating detail the names and addresses of people who couldn't be covered by your bill. But it seems to me the shoe's on the other foot when it comes to voting.
The plaintiff's inability to produce a single voter who would be adversely impacted by the law was important to Judge Murphy's determination that there was no significant burden posed by the photo ID law and should also be a very important consideration for the Texas Senate. Opponents of photo identification requirements have long argued, quite vocally and emphatically, that these laws would lead to disenfranchisement of, in Georgia's case, hundreds of thousands of voters. But when the state of Georgia finally had its day in court, it became clear that emotional and hyperbolic arguments used to argue against the state's photo identification law was simply empty rhetoric.
Indeed, the bill brings to mind events during the half-century following the Civil War, when the language of progressive reform in Texas cloaked the disfranchisement of blacks, Latinos, and poor whites, those most likely to vote for Republican or populist candidates. Actually adopted for partisan and racially discriminatory purposes, these laws were often presented as high-minded attacks on fraud, efforts to purify the electorate that would only inconvenience vote sellers or the ignorant and shiftless. Texas Senate Bill 362 appears to fit comfortably within the long and sad history of those in positions of power disfranchising the above populations for partisan gain. This, in my opinion, as a scholar whose work is focused on the protection of minority voting rights for more than 40 years, would be an egregious step backward.
Requiring photo ID simply helps election workers make sure that the person casting the vote at the ballot box is the same qualified registered voter that's listed in the poll book. The problem with Senate Bill 362 is that it would reduce fairness rather than promote it. This bill would hinder universal suffrage without addressing the main sources of voter fraud.
We can't have dead people voting in our elections. We can't have non-citizens voting in our elections. We can't have felons voting in our elections. The only way we're going to know who is voting in our elections is to be able to verify that the person who is voting is who they say they are. And the best way to do that is to require photo identification.
I think what you're fearing by proposing this bill is really a problem that barely exists, if at all. But the problem that you're going to create is bigger than the problem you see existing. One thing I know is that if you want to get people organized and excited, disenfranchise them.
750 people got laid off in Lone Star, Texas 2 weeks ago. They don't care about this. What they're concerned about is putting food on the table for their families. That's what y'all are elected to do, is represent those people, not political parties, not playing these games. It's to represent working families in the state of Texas.
Senator Fraser, you're recognized for a motion.
And if you don't mind, I'm waiting for all the senators who came in that stayed here all night. Members, it was a pretty amazing night, and it makes me remember why I'm so proud to be a member of this body. I appreciate so much everyone, the way they conduct themselves. Thank you, the staff. Thank you for the witnesses. We appreciate it. I would now move to report Senate Bill 362 to the full Senate with a recommendation that it do pass and be printed.
Senator Fraser moves that Senate Bill 362 be reported to the full Senate with a recommendation that it do pass and be printed. The Secretary will call the roll. There being 20 ayes and 12 noes, Senate Bill 362 will be reported to the full Senate with a recommendation that it do pass and be printed.